And here we go. Welcome to this evening's call. I'm very excited to bring members of our AG Bell Academy Mentoring Committee to you tonight to talk about using SMART goals to complete the F1. And I just want to cover a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we do have several people on the call, and so we have found in these past Calling All Mentors calls that the best way to communicate, generally speaking, is through the chat feature. So you're going to want to use the chat. Feel free as you have questions. You won't be interrupting, but feel free as you have questions to put those into the chat. You can put those directly to everyone, or if you, please do, just send them to everyone. If you have questions, those will be addressed, the chat will be monitored, and then later on in the call, there will be an opportunity for some people to speak and offer suggestions. This call is going to be interactive, but there certainly is a sort of a lecture portion here in the first few moments. And so using the chat feature, until we open up the microphones, I am going to close the mics where I can, but if it's handy for you, if you could close your mic so we won't hear noise in the background. And I think at this point, I would like to turn the microphone over to one of our co-chairs, which is Ellen Thomas.
It's so nice to have people on, and it's always exciting to see the names I'm familiar with and new names. So thank you so much for joining us. As an organization striving to increase the quality of intervention that children with hearing loss and their parents receive, the Academy has recognized that in addition to certification, we need to take care of our mentors as well. And so in 2017, the Mentoring Committee came about, and we're part of the AG Bell Academy. The specific topic of tonight's call came from concerns that the committee heard from some mentors stating that their mentees sometimes finish their 20th mentored session without the mentor feeling like the individual was ready to sit for the exam. So in response to that, it's important for mentors to remember that 20 sessions is a minimum and that it can be exceeded. But if you're going to exceed it, you want to be sure you've talked on the front end with your mentee so that they know that's a possibility, because whenever you're the one seeking to achieve the goal, you tend to be very focused on a specific number, and progress needs to be discussed in an ongoing manner. So tonight's call on SMART goals is going to review one tool that we have available to all of us that we can use to help both the mentor and mentee talk about and gauge progress so that you both are coming from the same place and understand where you are in the process. Okay, Gayla, if you'll advance the slide. These are pictures of all of us on the mentoring committee. AG Bell and all its committees are volunteer positions. And it's really nice, though, when you get to draw a committee from a group of people who are already vetted, knowing that they share the same goals as you, and they are hardworking, knowledgeable, skilled professionals, or they wouldn't be in the positions they are. If you look at the top two pictures, those are pictures of Sherry Fakinter and me. We're the co-chairs of the committee. In the next row, you see Anita Bernstein and Eli Gaffney. And on the bottom row, there's Lillian Henderson, Janne Lignell Johansson, and Karen Stein. And together we make up the current mentoring committee. Gayla, if you'll advance the slide for me. The goals of the mentoring committee are geared around supporting mentors. We want to engage mentors, and we really hope to increase the number of people who are interested in and take part in mentoring. We also always have in mind the Academy's mission and the desire to uphold the rigor of the certification. In addition to a mentoring committee, the Academy also has a certification committee. And I know we had Jane Maydell on the call at noon, and I believe we have Sherry Vernelson on this call. Sherry, if you want to just say hi.
Hello, everyone.
We are two committees that often work closely together because the issues that we deal with are overlapping to some degree, but we have a different focus. Gayla, if you'll move to the next slide. The F1 is the tool that we have to document progress and accountability, to focus learning and look at competencies. But it's important to recognize that this should be a tool used in a collaborative way. This shouldn't be just papers filled out and passed to the mentee, but it should at its best be a discussion between the mentor and the mentee about what happened, what went well, what the mentee might want to focus on next. And this is the perfect opportunity to practice the topic that we're talking about tonight, which is SMART goals. So I'm going to turn things over to Karen Stein. And thanks again to all of you for joining our call tonight.
Hi, just want to say welcome to everyone. We really appreciate you being here, especially at this time of day when I'm sure everyone has already put in a long day of work.
Karen, this is Sherry. If you wouldn't mind just 1 second turning on your video so that people can put
I thought I had.
your Audrey Hepburn face,
Yes,
your voice. That would be great, and then you can stop again. Thank you.
on my screen, my Audrey Hepburn face is right there. So is that working, Sherry? No?
I see you, Karen.
We see you, Karen.
I can see her. Okay, there I am, and now I'm going away because you don't need to be looking at me. All right, so we want to focus a little bit more on really expanding the value and the use that we get out of those F1 forms. So when I started to think about this, the first thing that came to my mind was that we need to remind ourselves that the F1 forms are not just for checking a box on the mentee's LISL application. Yes, it's important to be able to do that, but they really are much more powerful tool. They are really a driving force to be used for guiding LISL growth. And they're intended to help the mentee get started on this journey of professional development toward becoming a skilled LISL practitioner. But they're really, for me, I think about them as being a jumping off point for digging deeper in and being able to have some great discussions between mentor and mentee. As we take a step further from that purpose to look at, can we do more with them? And is it possible to use them to really track progress, not just to facilitate progress, but to keep track of it as well. And this takes a little bit of extra effort, and that's really what we're looking at today, is how might we be able to use them in order to keep track and monitor growth over time. And growth, we know, as that lovely picture on the right side of the slide demonstrates, does not come in a straight line. There are lots of ups and downs and back and forth. And so we need some kind of a system for tracking that progress, being able to recognize it and being able to keep track of it. And we were thinking that perhaps there was a way that we could make the F1 useful for this purpose, in addition for the benefits that we already are getting out of it. My guess is that many of you have developed your own way of keeping track of your mentees' growth. There are lots and lots of different ways that we could do this. When I got started mentoring, the first thing that I did was to ask my mentees at the beginning to have a discussion with me from which they identified some goals that they hope to achieve through the mentoring process. And then periodically over the journey, we would revisit those goals and see where we stood with them, where they were taking us, if we needed to make any revisions or additions. So that process worked for me. I know others that I've talked with that have a fondness for grids, I'm not naming names, and have designed charts where they've isolated skills and are able to document progress in individual skills on those charts. And so that's another tool that may be of some value in terms of trying to find a system for monitoring the growth in LISL competencies of your mentees. I would like to take a minute for you to really reflect on your own experiences and ask you to think about if there have been tools that you have experienced either as a mentor or as a mentee when you've tried in some way to document progress and growth. I know that among us, we have a wealth of experience, and so I think sharing our experiences would be of great benefit to everyone. So the question at hand right now is, first, are you mentoring your mentees' growth? And then if you answer yes to that, what tools do you use to monitor that growth? And I'm going to try, as difficult as it is, to be quiet for about a minute and ask that those of you that have some experience with it share in the chat some of the tools that you found either to be useful or to be lacking. And Ellen has posed the question in the chat room. So I'm looking for volunteers. Has anyone designed their own tool? Or if you want to make the question a bit more global, have you not been using tools because you find it difficult to monitor growth? And is that a challenge for some people? Sherry, are you, I don't know, it probably hasn't even been close to a minute, but I feel like it's been 10.
Yes, I mean, I'll jump in here and just maybe talk about some of the things that I've done. And if anybody else on the mentoring committee has another addition, maybe we can take a minute and share some of our ideas. I'm the grid person that Karen's talking about. And I've done a couple different things. One thing that I've done is, made a list of auditory verbal strategies down one side of a grid, and across the top, I number maybe 1 through 5 or 1 through 8, meaning the different mentored sessions that I'm doing. And then I can kind of have a visual of, is the mentee using the same strategies? Sometimes I ask them to keep track on the grid. What strategies do you see yourself using in this video? So those are just one of the things that, oh, can I share my grid? Yes, I'm happy to share my grid. And this might be a good time to let people know that one of the tasks of the mentoring committee this year is to come up with some resources to be able to share with you that relate directly to each individual section of the F1. So that's some of the work that we're doing right now. But it looks like you've got some people popping up with some answers there if you want to take a summary of those, Karen.
Well, it looks like the Mentor's Guide, and then Cheryl Dickinson also has a tool that both of those have been mentioned several times. I love, there's a really interesting comment that someone identified their mentee is one who asks, am I meeting the competencies for this year, for this part of the year? And I think that's a really nice way of reminding us that we need to do something to be able to answer that question, and perhaps to be able to document it as well. Ellen, I know you said somewhere that you monitor which strategies you see your mentee using. Do you use a format for that, or can you elaborate a little bit?
I have a list of different strategies, and it's not a grid, but I put check marks next to them. So it could be a grid. But I also found when I was mentoring people, because of the diverse population that we see in our clinic, that I tracked also if they were using various strategies across different age groups, and if they were applying them appropriately to different age groups, even if their listening age was maybe similar. I also find that especially younger professionals new to practicing needed sometimes help in knowing how to coach parents of different ages and backgrounds. They often felt comfortable with a parent that was similar in age to them, but not if the parent was older than them. And so that's a conversation that we sometimes have.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I know we had been talking before about the fact that growth in the LISL competencies can look messy because you may be working with someone who's working with different kinds of kids, different kinds of families, and that sounds like a really nice way to accommodate to that kind of variation, which is important. I'm looking at SMART. Someone made a comment about SMART goals, which is what we're going to be talking about further. So maybe this is a good time to move on to the next slide. Okay, so one of the things in just discussion with our committee, one of the things we came up with was identifying one tool. It is one of many, as you have outlined in your chats, and I thank you for contributing to that. One tool that could be useful in incorporating it into the F1 to make the F1 usable for tracking growth, and that is the SMART goals. And I know that many of you are familiar with SMART goals. It's certainly anyone who's teaching children is familiar with the term and has been using them. So it's not something new, but it is something that we could do within the structure of the F1 that will allow for clear communication and clear expectations, and also be a way, a fairly easy way, to monitor growth. And so if you will move to the next slide, thank you. We thought we would just take a look at what SMART goals are. And really thinking about them as being something that we're going to be using with adults as opposed to children, and so looking at them a little bit differently, but that they would be fairly easy to incorporate on the F1. So the sort of the history of SMART goals is that they came out of the business community in the early 1980s and have been used now for fairly commonly across the board for writing IEP goals. So I'm sure you're all familiar with them in that venue. If you want some more information about using SMART goals with mentees, I recommend taking a look at Hearing First, their learning experience. It's quite a good resource. As mentors, we're looking at writing goals collaboratively, and I say that with a little bit of acoustic highlighting because it's an important piece of developing the goals, and that the idea of coming together and identifying goals is really about helping to support growth rather than to direct it, so to speak. And so we thought that SMART goals on the end section of the F1 would be a fairly easy way to take advantage of this. A SMART goal has basically 5 components. It needs to be specific. In other words, you have to say exactly what it is, clearly and well defined, in order to have a greater chance of meeting that goal. Who is going to be doing it? Where will it happen? What exactly will be happening and in what context? All that clarity then helps you improve your focus on whatever particular goal you've chosen for growth. SMART goals are also measurable. So the criteria for measuring, it needs to be stated and it needs to be tangible. You want to think about how you will know when the goal has been achieved. What will it look like? What results would you see that would make you say that the goal has been attained? And goals need to be realistic. They need to be attainable. You need to set a goal for something that you know is going to be possible to do. So in other words, a mentee that knows that a goal for her work would be a good acoustic environment, but she's been put in a gymnasium because that's the only spot available, that's probably not going to happen. It's not a realistic goal. So how could you make the goals realistic so that the mentor and the mentee both know that if you work hard, you're going to achieve some success, because that's what motivates all of us. The goals also need to be relevant, and I think that's where the individualizing comes into play. So they need to fit the family, they need to fit the situation, they need to fit the mentee and the kind of work that they're doing. And then finally, they need to be time-based. You need to not just say that they're going to get better at something, but you want to say that by such and such a time, it's going to increase. And all of those characteristics then make the goal an easy one to use in terms of monitoring progress. I think now I'm going to turn the next slide over to our newest committee member, Eli.
Hey, I'm Eli, and I'm going to share about how and when we will use SMART goals in connection to the F1. So we were thinking about, what do we do when the mentee and the mentor have a difference of opinion, or if we find that we're stuck on the same goal each different session and we're reviewing it again and again. And what we're thinking is that by using SMART goals, it's a process. because we write them together, we collaborate in the development, it becomes its own learning process based on this coaching conversation that focuses on the F1 and the observed session. So as we're getting towards the end of the meeting, we're reflecting, and we find it very helpful to identify possible areas of focus for the next session. We often refer to those as the 3 wishes. So concluding the transitioning the conversation by asking if you had 3 wishes or 3 areas you would like to target, what could those be? And talking through them, and then commenting, if you could pick just one, which one do you think has the highest priority? Which one do you think has the biggest impact right now? And then that's how you would drive your area of target for the next goal. But we're also, as the mentor, writing down these notes about other potential areas, writing down our notes about brainstorming, so that we have an idea of other directions that need to be addressed as well. Something that we have heard for feedback is mentors might have a fear or a concern that the mentee will pick an area or a topic that the mentor wouldn't have chosen. And some of these conversations can be really hard, but if we have these honest conversations throughout the process, we're typically in agreement through the brainstorming process. And sometimes we find that a mentee can pick a better goal for themselves than the mentor would have initially chosen. Another fear that we've come up with is if we're just writing one goal per observation, that is that limiting progress. And because the SMART goals are teaching this whole process of reflecting on their learning and planning for future learning, we don't find that that limits progress. We're being very specific, measurable. Because it's relevant and attainable, we can transfer these skills into practice. We have new behaviors that are developing, and we have our notes that lead us on to the next skill to develop. So let's go to the next slide and talk about some potential questions to think of as we're writing these goals. So one thing to remember is that we might be used to writing SMART goals for a child or a parent in development of an IEP document. So these goals, while they have the same components, are written specifically for the mentee or the professional's change in behavior or growth of skill. So I'll briefly go through what's written on the screen here. These are things that you would either ponder or directly discuss in your coaching conversation. We're talking about specific skills. Have you targeted the actual skill that needs to be changed or improved? And we'll get to some examples in a minute of what kinds of skills you might target. Something we have discussed already is use of strategies. I think that's a very common specific skill. When we're talking about how we're measuring it, is it measured just as a task completed, or is it measured through maintaining it over a course of a certain number of sessions? Are we increasing or are we decreasing? Is it attainable? Do we have the background knowledge to achieve the goal? And something that we've talked about is if a mentee chooses a goal that the mentor might not be in agreement with, we can look at some different hierarchies of skills and maybe find a foundational skill that gives us a connection to their original idea and make sure that they are able to access resources to meet this goal, whether that's research or observing another professional or perhaps learning about a family's background. to access that information before we're looking for progress. We're looking at which domain does the goal fall under. I'm sure you're all familiar with this little pie chart, and I find it very helpful for my mentees to tell me which domain they think it would be under when we target a goal, and see, do we even know what we're working on right now, and why is it relevant? That's a very important question. Why are we doing this? How is it impacting my practice? Kind of that age-old question, when am I going to use this later? And make sure it's relevant to the learner. And then, of course, time-based. How long are we going to be monitoring this, and when do we expect it to be achieved? And is there a guideline that we typically look for, or is it something that develops over a longer period of time? Sari, are you ready to transition to an example, or would you like me to review what Ellen is sharing on chat?
I think we're good to move on, but I think it might be good before we go to our example to just open up for any questions people might have so far about writing SMART goals. I think, as been mentioned before, we're writing goals all the time for children. So it's writing the goals knowing that they need to be specific and measurable and relevant and time-based. We're pretty used to that when it comes to writing them for children, or even for parents sometimes. But what does it look like when we write them for mentees and with mentees? So I think it might be good if just even we take a minute and see if anybody has any specific questions that they would like us to answer to this point. So if you do, please take a moment and type your question in the chat box. Okay, I think we're going to move on. You can certainly type a question in there later if you want to. The chat is there, and we do have the ability to capture the chat so that the mentoring committee will, be able to look back at this later and digest some of the information that's on there, and possibly decide how to disseminate some of this information which might be valuable for you. So Gayla, we can move to the next slide. And we're going to look at a scenario and kind of walk through the process of writing a SMART goal for this particular scenario. So what we have here is you've had your first mentored session with Jill, your mentee. And one of the things that came up in your discussion, when you're asking her how she felt the session went, came up independently on her own, was that she was really surprised when she watched the videos back how fast she was talking. And haven't we all had that experience of watching our own videos of ourselves, which can be kind of painful sometimes. It's a great learning tool, but sometimes it's hard to watch yourself. And she commented that she also noticed she had done 2 30-minute videos, and they were 2 different students. It was an AV Ed setting, that she noticed on her own that she didn't vary her rate of speech depending on the level of the child she was working with. And so she had a lot of questions about that we kind of talked through. And then we brainstormed some things of saying, well, what do you think about this? Is this something that might be what you want to focus on for your next mentored session? And I'm going to reiterate again the idea that it was difficult for me at first to get into the habit of only kind of identifying and writing one SMART goal, because I was one of these people that was worried that it wasn't going to move the practice as quickly as I thought it might need to move. But what I've found in practice is that throughout the session with the mentee, you're talking about a lot of different things that they might be interested in learning more about or changing about their practice. And 9 times out of 10, they're working on those other things too. But this one particular targeted skill is what we're going to be measuring. And again, it's about the process. It's about learning what is the process for change. Because just wanting to change isn't going to change you. There has to be some way that you can move about changing your practice. So we discussed what impact this might have on the child's perception of speech, and Jill decides that she would like to learn more about this. She doesn't really have the answers to those questions when I say to her, so do you know how many words per minute a child who is 3 or 4 or 5 can actually understand? What are they actually able to perceive? And she didn't have the answers to those questions. And she felt that that was a really important thing to change about our practice. So we wrote a SMART goal on this. So what I'd like to do right now is kind of walk through what a SMART goal for this might look like, and kind of engage everyone in the chat if you're willing to indulge us here. So if we can go back, Ellen, everyone knows the scenario now. If we can go back to slide number, I think it was Eli's slide. Let's go back to slide number 9. Yeah, that one. Whoops, now the other one, sorry. There we go. Okay, so we're working with a mentee who now is recognizing that her rate of speech is very quick. And now we're going to get to the business of what are we going to do about this? The so what? Why is this important to change this? So if we're saying specific, if you can type in chat, what would the specific skill be that we would want to be targeting in this SMART goal? What is the skill that the mentee is looking to change? Her rate of speech. She's going to vary her rate of speech depending on the level of the child. She's going to regulate her speech to match the auditory skill of the child. Her prosody. Yeah, she wants to change her rate of speech. I mean, that's pretty specific. We don't really need to beat that up too much. But now we have to think, well, that's nice that you want to do that, but how are we going to do it? How are we going to know that you've done it? So we brainstormed again some different ideas about how she could do this. And I think Ellen has a whole goal there. She's going to research and identify what rate of speech is optimal for a child 4 to 6 years and demonstrate this rate when working with these 2 children. So the question is, do we do this just once? Is she only going to do this once and then forget about it and we're going to move on to another goal? Is it measured as task completed? Check the box. Is this something we're going to come back to time and time again? And then the idea of, well, how much time do you need to really change your rate of speech? I mean, that's a pretty big target for yourself when you think about it. Difficult for me personally because I tend to be a fast talker. And we're going through these time-based, when do we think we can achieve this goal? And what domain is this falling under? Why is it important? Why is it relevant to what we're doing? I'm going to give a second to see if anybody else has anything else they might be thinking about. A conversation, if you're having a conversation with your mentee about this, what might be some questions that you might ask her to get her thinking about how she can write a SMART goal? Because we're doing this together. We're not doing it for her. So we've talked about you want to change your rate of speech. And it's okay to give your mentee ideas about how they might do that. So what might be some questions that you might want to ask your mentee to help drive the completion of this SMART goal? Yeah, how are you going to know? How are you going to know when your rate of speech is more appropriate? So we're going to move to our next slide, well, the slide that we would have been on, and talk a little bit about this. You'll see that this is not perfectly done. If you look at all of this, this is where we would write the SMART goal on the F1. This is written together so that when the mentee gets this F1, nothing on this section, this goal or recommendation section, is going to be a surprise to her. So what we came up with in the recommendations for her next session, there's a little typo there, as you can see. You have chosen to focus on your rate of speech for your next mentored session so that you will have the skill of self-correcting. These were words that she used. She wanted to self-correct, and a general awareness of how fast you are talking. With some children, you may want a faster or more normal rate of speech. So what we came up with after brainstorming was some of these things. In order to reach this goal, here's what you're going to do. You're going to watch Mr. Rogers, and you're going to note his rate of speech. I happen to be a huge Mr. Rogers fan. I haven't seen the movie yet, so don't put any spoilers in the group chat there. On her own, she said, I really want to watch the video again. I want to see if I can figure out, well, how fast am I talking? Do I just sound fast, but maybe I'm really not? And she went back and watched the video of herself and tried to calculate how many words she thought she was actually speaking in a minute. And then, of course, she was going to do some research and try and find some different materials where she could learn about how many words per minute a child is able to hear, process, and understand. So I knew what the answer to that question was, but it is better for her to have to go and do some of that work on her own. And then I would share resources with her if I felt that she didn't find them on her own. But I usually find that they end up giving me great resources that I wouldn't have found on my own. So then here's the part that's what's going to happen next. She notes who she thinks might be a good student to do for her next mentored session. We write the date that the session is due and when we're going to meet to discuss it. And then at that point, we talk to her. We're going to talk about what she found about the rate of speech. So the one thing that I think is really important for us to remember is we have to follow up with these goals. Just like in an IEP or an IFSP, you don't write the goal and never revisit it or never look at it to see if the goal's been met. So I'm either going to be in touch with my mentee before our next mentored session, if it's a longer time than usual, to touch base and say, hey, how's that going for you? Do you notice any change in your practice? But the important part of writing a SMART goal is that we come back to it. The other thing that I've taken to doing lately, again, reminding on the grid, is that I take this section of the F1 and I transfer it into a Word document that has 1 through 20 listed on it. So all of the goals are in this mentor summary as opposed to just flipping through the F1. So they're really easily accessible. I also put on that any follow-up that I might be doing as the mentor. And sometimes I write that in the goals and recommendations as well. Ellen, I'm going to ask you if there's anything in chat that we need to address, or looks like there was a lot going on, so we don't have time to read everything, but if there's anything specific that we need to go over at this time.
I think that the bulk of the conversation in chat came out of Amanda's question about whether people are writing this goal with their mentee. And a number of us responded that we were doing it collaboratively during when we were meeting together with the mentee.
Absolutely. So this is just everybody, there's no set way that you have to mentor. Everybody will bring their own style to the way that they mentor. But typically the way that I will mentor is we'll begin the session talking about, what they really liked about the session that they did. And then we'll go through different sections. I'll ask them what they want to talk about. We'll have our conversation. And then at the end, usually the wrap up for me, and it's not written in this particular F1, but often I will identify, you've identified the following 3 goals that you would like to consider working on. And I'll list the 3 goals, and then I'll say, of those 3 goals, you've decided to focus on whatever it is, your rate of speech, or sharing books in a more meaningful way, or whatever that one area may be. But it is definitely something that I leave the session with. We have a goal in place that we've come up with together before we leave the mentoring session.
And I'll just say, Sherry, that I did not start my mentoring of others this way. It's something that I evolved to based on talking with other people and going through the Hearing First course. But when I first started mentoring, it was I was floundering a lot, I think. And I appreciate the patience of the people that I mentored early on. But the more specific I've helped people get, and the more discussion we've had, I feel like the end result has been much clearer and better, and I don't know, just ended up with a better outcome, and people knowing what they had achieved and why.
Okay, so we are going to hand over now to Anita, and she's going to take us through the next couple slides. So Anita, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anita, and I really just wanted to see whether there were any questions before we move on to another example of a SMART goal. Was there something you were thinking about? Please be sure that you put it in the chat, and then we'll be able to deal with that. So let's say then that you, for example, were chatting with your mentee about how the parent can continue to check on their child's listening abilities at home, and to see whether they're able to do it at a distance or close by. You've talked with them about the importance of doing the Ling test, and what information you're going to get from that. And when you're done with that, you're thinking about, how am I going to help this parent? What information can I give him to help? So one of the things that you see on this example is using Sylvia's rainbow audiogram, and helping the parent to understand what speech acoustics is all about. So, what in fact is the goal here? Is it about the 6-sound test? Is it about coaching the parent? What is your real goal here? So you want to be sure that you identify your specific goal. Which one would you think is the important goal here? Anyone? So remember that one of the things that we're trying to do here is help your mentee to identify the goal. So I'm thinking that if I'm looking at this, that it's coaching the parent on how to actually administer that. Exactly. That's exactly what we would be looking at. Focus on coaching the parent, given the information that she needs, and then move forward with that. Anybody else have a comment? Would you add anything else to this? Do you have some information that you would like to help our mentee here? So they need to coach the parent. They, as Ellen says, if they understand what it is that the Ling test is actually addressing, they would be more likely to use that test at home. So the outcome here really is to help our mentee to coach parents. And I don't know whether you have had the same experience I have. I think sometimes that is the biggest hurdle that some of my mentees have had to take and jump over, because they're actually get very good at getting their SMART goals organized for the child, but not always able to really identify what goal it is that they have for the parent in that particular session. So this example really gives us a very good idea of remembering that you also need to have specific goals for the parent. Do you want to take a moment now just to think about some questions that you may have about SMART goals? We are going to capture all the information in the chat so that we can use these for our next meeting of Calling All Mentors. So it's really important for you to think about how are you going to be using these particular SMART goals? What did we cover that was really helpful for you? And also, what other skills did you feel you needed some more support on? So please, do put it into our chat so that we're able to help you with that. And also, if you have some other resources that would be helpful for all of us to use, that would be really great if you could put that on the chat as well.
And I'll just add, Anita, that we would like to know from you who've taken the time to log in, any topics that you feel like would be beneficial to discuss in this forum, this type of forum. Our goal is really to help support mentors, and this is one of our efforts to try and do so.
Anita, I think you can go to the next slide because the next slide is kind of what you're talking about right now, which is just what questions do you have about SMART goals? And then the following slide giving some suggestions for our next Calling All Mentors call. There we go.
Right. So I think that some of you are mentioning that you think that maybe SMART goals would be limiting you when you're moving ahead with your mentee. What other ways are you, how are you putting together your goals for your mentee if you're not going to be using the SMART goals? Are you going through a checklist? What is it that you're using if you don't use SMART goals?
And I think it's important too to recognize that the SMART goal is just one tool. And at least for me, and I think for most people, it's accompanies a much bigger conversation about the mentored session. But this is just really honing in then on something that can be specific and measurable to help the mentee and you gauge whether progress is happening. In the chat, there are a couple of comments from people who are going to begin mentoring and are finding this helpful. And I'm delighted, first of all, I think all of us on the mentoring committee are thrilled to hear that we have some people who are going to start out mentoring because we need you and we really appreciate that. And this is one of those times when you can really benefit from the struggles of the people who have gone before you. And I certainly wish that I had started out with this idea in my plan for mentoring. I think I would have fumbled around less if I had had this thought going into it.
Thanks, Ellen, for those comments. I think you know, having a checklist of the different skills that we're helping people develop, our mentees develop, is some of the information that seems to have helped others. And I think the SMART goals will guide people's mentoring experiences. I'm just wondering whether we could go to the next slide and just talk a little bit about the kinds of tools or the kind of information that we could have in our next time together with everyone's in the Calling All Mentors meetings. And as you can see, we have that there as well, tools to guide your observations. Are the SMART goals helping you with that? Do you need other tools that would help you? What else would you like to know about? Do you feel you have enough information on how to build your relationship with your mentee? Or is that an area that you want to us to have a discussion about? Maybe you can put in, I see there's a few people writing in the chat, and so a list of resources is something that people would be interested in. So if you have some resources that you're using, it'd be great for you to add to the ones that we already have under the mentoring tab on the Academy website. Please send them to us so that we can add that in. I see that Mila is going to be sharing some of her resources with us so that we can add that to the information that we already have there. Now, there's a question about the F1 being culturally relevant. Is it, when you have different clientele, are you finding that the F1 does not allow for that information? Can you be a little bit more specific as well? Maybe you could send us some information on that. What kinds of examples can we add to the F1 that would make it more culturally sensitive?
Or maybe even if you don't mind opening your mic and just talking about this a little bit, because I think this is from reading what you put in chat, I think as a committee, we would like to hear from you on this topic.
Oh, okay. I'm just trying to find the place on the F1 form where it asks about the mentee being responsive to culture, and I can't just find it. Maybe one of my colleagues here in Australia can. Maybe it's under parent training.
I think it is under, this is Sherry. I do
Yes.
believe it's under the parent education. I think it's something about being responsive to the parents.
Engages a parent according to the parent's learning style. That's okay. No, I just can't see it.
So I think because I'm conscious of our time here
Yes.
as well, I'm happy to put my email, and Ellen, maybe while I'm talking, you can put your email in there as well. I think it is good for you to know that we used to be the baby committee on the Academy. That's no longer the case because we now have the Global Matters committee, and they're really looking to gather a lot of this information. So any feedback that we can funnel towards them in this regard would be really great for them to have. So you see Ellen's email there, that you can send it, and maybe we can kind of continue this conversation offline, because I am conscious of trying to keep to our hour. There never just seems to be enough time, but I see it's on there. Accommodates for different family structures and diversities. Being culturally sensitive, I think, is what we're talking about there. So I would really love to have you follow up with that. And what Anita has on here are just some ideas that we've bounced around as the mentoring committee for possible topics for our next Calling All Mentor calls. So if you have one of these three that really stands out to you, if you would type it in chat, again, we can be able to collect all of this. And if you have an idea that's not one of these three, feel free to put that in as well. And maybe people can do that, Anita, as you go on to the next slide and just share the resources, and then hand over to Gayla to wrap us up for tonight.
Can we have the next slide then of the resources that we have found really helpful that we would like to encourage you to look at? Gayla, could you move that forward? Okay, so there we are. We have two resources that many of us have found really, really helpful. The evocative coaching has been a book that we've used in a number of the courses that we've taken, and it's been a really helpful one. And as well, the Center for School Transformation website, if you want to have the time to go in there and just have a look. And we have found both of those to be really helpful. If you have some other ones, please do help us with that and add them on as well. Now, in that last slide that just popped up for you now is 3 of the resources that we use to put together this particular presentation, and they too could be some very strong resources for you on how to develop SMART goals and to move forward with your mentoring experience.
Thanks, Anita. Gayla, if you can finish us out there. And once again, thank you everyone so much for joining tonight, and stay tuned. We'll be discussing as the committee what our next Calling All Mentor calls will be after we have a chance to review the chat. And thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everyone. We have recorded this session. I'm going to turn that off now. And within the next 2 to 4 weeks, it takes a little while because we make edits to it, but we will send an email out to those who registered, and it will have a link to the recording. It will also be placed on the mentoring portion of the Academy website. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. And on that note, we'll let you go. Thank you.